Welcome to Titans of Terror, where we look at the men and women who have shaped the horror landscape. Today's subject, filmmaker George A. Romero. George Andrew Romero Jr. was born on February 4th, 1940, in the New York City borough of the Bronx, to a Lithuanian mother and a Spanish commercial artist. George was raised in the Parkchester section of the Bronx and would frequently ride the subway into Manhattan to rent film reels to view at his house. He was one of only two people who repeatedly rented the opera-based film The Tales of Hoffman, the other being future director Martin Scorsese. George has stated that the film gave him an early appreciation for the power of visual media. George graduated from Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh in 1960. He started out by shooting short films, industrial films, and TV commercials. One of his early commercial films was a segment for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, in which Mr. Rogers underwent a tonsillectomy. George co-founded the Latent Image with his friend Russell Striner. After producing a high-budget Calgon commercial spoofing the movie Fantastic Voyage, George felt that the company had the experience and equipment to produce a feature film. The Latent Image teamed up with Hardman Associates Inc. to create a production company for a single motion picture, 1968's Night of the Living Dead. The film is about a ragtag group of Pennsylvanians barricading themselves in an old farmhouse to remain safe from a horde of flesh-eating ghouls that are ravaging the area. Made for just $114,000, the film was a groundbreaking achievement. The film's success wasn't just due to its innovative use of horror. It was because it addressed the societal issues of the time: race, survival, and civil unrest. And its shocking ending left audiences stunned. In Night of the Living Dead, the real monster isn't the undead, it's human beings' fear and distrust of one another. The film is now heralded as one of the greatest horror films ever made. In 1971, George detoured drastically by making There's Always Vanilla, also known as The Affair, a romantic comedy about a young man returning to his home city of Pittsburgh and moving in with an older woman whom he begins to rely on for emotional and financial support. George himself has stated that he considers this film to be his worst, and has referred to the film as a quote-unquote total mess. The next year, George would return to the supernatural with Season of the Witch, also known as Hungry Wives and Jack's Wife. The film follows a neglected, unhappy suburban housewife in Pittsburgh who becomes involved in witchcraft after meeting a local witch who inspires her to follow her own path. George has stated that this is the only one of his films he would have liked to have remade. He cited lack of money as a reason for unhappiness with the production. George next turned to psychological horror with a film called The Amusement Park. The film was commissioned by the Lutheran Service Society of Western Pennsylvania as an educational film about elder abuse and ageism. The film acts as a metaphorical description of how the elderly are mistreated, overlooked, and undervalued. The film was perceived to be lost until 2017, when a print surfaced from a Torino film festival years prior. The film was restored and got a proper release in 2021. In 1973, George brought us the science fiction horror film The Crazies, about residents of a small American town that accidentally become afflicted by a man-made military bacterial virus that causes permanent insanity and death. The Crazies was a box office failure upon release due to poor distribution, but the film has since become a cult favorite. A remake of the film was released in 2010. The next year, George returned to his roots when he made the sports documentary O.J. Simpson: Juice on the Loose, about the successful Buffalo Bills running back O.J. Simpson. The film also gives a quote-unquote fascinating insight into the lifestyle of this complex and remarkable, likable athlete. George then returned in 1977 with the vampire tale Martin, about a troubled young man who believes himself to be a vampire, going to live with his elderly and hostile cousin in a small Pennsylvanian town, where he tries to suppress his bloodlust. The film marked George's first collaboration with special effects makeup master Tom Savini. although in this film he was just an actor. Martin was seized and confiscated in the UK under Section 3 of the Obscene Publications Act of 1959 during the video nasty panic. The original cut of the film ran approximately 2 hours and 45 minutes. George also wanted to shoot it in black and white, which was nixed by the producer. For his next film, George met up with Italian horror maestro Dario Argento to help secure financing in exchange for international distribution rights. That film would be George's first sequel, 1978's Dawn of the Dead. The film is about two SWAT team members, a traffic reporter, and his TV executive girlfriend seeking refuge in a secluded shopping mall during an escalating zombie epidemic. George and Dario edited different versions of the film for different markets. Film critic Roger Ebert even called Dawn of the Dead one of the best horror movies ever made. The success of the film spawned a seemingly endless series of unofficial Italian sequels. In 2004, an official remake was released. George switched gears once again in 1981 with Night Riders, an action drama about a traveling Renaissance fair troupe that joust on motorcycles. Author Stephen King makes a cameo in the crowd, making a few sarcastic comments during the troupe's first performance while munching on a large sandwich. The next year, George would team up with Stephen King to make the horror anthology Creepshow, which was Stephen's screenwriting debut. The film consists of 5 short stories inspired by the EC horror comics of the 1950s. It would be George's first work for a major Hollywood studio. The film would go on to be the highest-grossing horror film for the Warner Brothers studio that year. The film also spawned 2 sequels and a successful television program. Speaking of television, George created a syndicated horror anthology show called Tales from the Dark Side, which also incorporated elements of science fiction and fantasy. The show would last for 4 seasons, producing 92 episodes. In 1985, George returned to the world of zombies for Day of the Dead, about a group of survivors of a zombie apocalypse sheltering in an underground bunker in Florida, where they must determine the outcome of humanity's conflict with the undead horde. The film initially did not match the critical and commercial success of its predecessors, but has since developed a cult following. George has deemed the film to be his personal favorite in the original Dead trilogy. The film spawned 2 remakes and a television show. George would return to a major studio in 1988 with the psychological horror Monkey Shines, which follows a young athlete who becomes a paralyzed quadriplegic and develops a bond with an intelligent service monkey named Ella, who becomes homicidal after she is injected with an experimental serum of human brain tissue. The film would eventually become a minor cult classic. 1990 saw George involved in segments for 2 separate anthology films. First, he wrote the screenplay for the Cat from Hell segment in Tales from the Dark Side, the movie. The short was based on a story by Stephen King. George also wrote and directed a segment called The Facts in the Case of Monsieur Voldemort for the film Two Evil Eyes. This one was based on a work by Edgar Allan Poe about a greedy wife's attempt to embezzle her dying husband's fortune. 3 years later, George would resurface with another Stephen King adaptation called The Dark Half, about a writer's fictional alter ego wanting to take over his life. The film received mixed reviews, but received praise for Timothy Hutton's against-type performance as well as the screenplay. The film would win 3 awards at the Fanta Festival in Italy, including Best Film, Best Screenplay, and Best Actor. In 1998, George would make a live-action television commercial for the video game Resident Evil 2. The 30-second advertisement starred Brad Renfro and Adrian France as the 2 main characters from the game. The commercial was quite popular and was shown in the weeks before the game's actual release, although a contract dispute prevented it from being shown outside of Japan. In the year 2000, George returned to his independent roots with Bruiser, about a man awakening to find his face has been replaced by a blank white mask after years of being abused. His personality has changed, and he seeks revenge against those who have humiliated him. George also directed the music video Scream by the legendary punk band The Misfits. His only payment was that he wanted the band to appear in the movie. For his final 3 films, George returned to the world of the zombies. First was 2005's Land of the Dead, which became the most financially successful of the entire franchise. The survivors have fled to the Golden Triangle area of downtown Pittsburgh, where a feudal like government exists, protected on two sides by rivers and on the third by an electric barricade termed the Throat. The film would feature some well known actors this time, such as Dennis Hopper and John Leguizamo. The film would spawn a prequel video game entitled Land of the Dead Return to Fiddler's Green. The fifth installment of the Dead franchise, called Diary of the Dead, came 2 years later. This time shot found footage style, it concerns a group of young film students running into real life zombies while filming a horror movie of their own. The final installment of the franchise is 2009's Survival of the Dead. The story follows a group of AWOL National Guardsmen who briefly appeared in Diary of the Dead, getting mixed up between two warring families. It has a very Hatfields and McCoy type of vibe to it. This would be the least successful of the franchise. George A. Romero was a man who loved the art of storytelling. His films weren't just products, they were messages, reflections of a world he was trying to understand and explain. And though he was often seen as a master of horror, he always saw himself as a filmmaker who wanted to engage people, who wanted to make them think. Romero's legacy is not only in the films he made, but in the fear he brought to life, the ideas he challenged, and the inspiration he sparked. The Bat salutes the godfather of the zombie film, George A. Romero, a true titan of terror.